Today, we're going to try and make sense of the incredibly complex war in the Middle East. To really get what's happening in the headlines, you've got to understand the backstory. And it's a long one, stretching back over a century. So let's dive right in.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at what's happening right now, this big multi-front war. Then, we'll hit rewind and pinpoint the exact spark that set it all off. From there, we'll go way back, over 100 years, to uncover the deep roots of the conflict. And finally, we'll tie it all together to see the big picture. All right, so let's start with today. What began as a conflict focused on Gaza has, well, it's just exploded. It's now a full-blown multi-front war that's pulling in all sorts of new players and cranking up the tension across the whole region.
So, what we're looking at here are basically three different but totally connected war fronts. First, you've got Gaza, where there's this really tense, uneasy ceasefire, and Israel now controls more than half of it. Then, up in Lebanon, it's an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah, that very powerful militia backed by Iran. And then, the big one. The conflict has gone direct between Israel, the US, and Iran, with actual strikes on Iran itself and retaliations lighting up across 9 different countries. It's a huge escalation.
But how did we get here, right? This massive, complicated war, it didn't just pop up out of thin air. You can trace it all back to one single, absolutely devastating day in 2023.
That day, October 7th, 2023, that was the spark. The attacks by Hamas on Israel were the trigger for a massive military response from Israel, one that just kept expanding until it became the regional firestorm we see today.
And the scale of that attack was just staggering. We're talking about 1,195 people killed inside Israel on that one day, and the vast majority of them, over 800, were civilians.
The response, in turn, has been on an equally massive scale. Israel's military campaign in Gaza that followed has led to a reported death toll of more than 75,000 Palestinians. These are the figures reported in the source material.
Okay, so to really get to the why of all this, why October 7th happened, why the war escalated the way it did, we have to go back. And I don't mean just a few years. We're talking about rewinding the clock more than 100 years.
So it all really begins back in 1917 with Britain's Balfour Declaration. Think of it as a promise made during the colonial era. From there, you see decades of tension building and building between Arab and Jewish communities until it all comes to a head in 1947. That's when the UN steps in with a plan to split or partition the land. And that plan, well, it basically set the stage for war.
And this right here is the absolute critical moment. Jewish leaders said yes to the plan. They accepted the two-state proposal, but Arab leaders rejected it completely. And that fundamental disagreement, that inability to agree on how to divide the land, that led directly to Israel declaring its independence. The very next day, war broke out.
And this is so important to understand. The exact same event is seen through 2 completely different and deeply traumatic lenses. For Israelis, it's their celebrated War of Independence, the birth of their nation. For Palestinians, it's the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. It's the moment when around 700,000 of them either fled or were forced from their homes, becoming refugees.
So that 1948 war, it wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. In fact, it was really just the beginning of a 75-year cycle of more wars, more violence, and a military occupation that has shaped pretty much everything since.
Then you have another huge turning point in 1967, the Six-Day War. In just under a week, it was a massive victory for Israel, capturing huge swaths of land, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And that was the start of the military occupation of Palestinian territories, an occupation that is still going on today and is absolutely central to the conflict.
Now, it's not like nobody tried to make peace. There were attempts. The biggest one by far was the Oslo Accords back in the 90s. But when that process fell apart, wow. It didn't just fail. Its collapse actually kicked off a whole new, brutal cycle of violence and left this deep, deep distrust on all sides that we're still dealing with. And at the same time, another massive piece gets added to the chessboard. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution completely changes the game. Suddenly, you have a powerful new player in the region, Iran, that is ideologically, fundamentally opposed to Israel's existence.
And you can see how this escalated over the decades. First, Iran just cuts off all ties with Israel. Then it starts funding and arming what are called proxy groups. You've probably heard of them. Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. But the real game changer was Iran's nuclear program. By 2025, it reached a point that Israel saw as a red line. And that's what ultimately led to the direct, head-on confrontation we're seeing now.
So let's pull back and look at the big picture.
When you connect all these dots, all these wars, these events, these turning points, you start to see that they're all just symptoms of a handful of core, unresolved problems that have been fueling this fire for over 100 years. I mean, if you boil down an entire century of history, this is what you get. These are the pillars holding up the conflict. You've got that colonial promise that gave one piece of land to two different peoples. You've got the double-sided trauma of 1948. You've got the ongoing, unresolved occupation since '67. Then you add in an ideological enemy like Iran and its allies. And on top of all that, a literal graveyard of failed peace deals that just made everyone trust each other less.
And what this really drives home is one of the central tragedies of this whole story. For more than 100 years, whenever there are grievances, and there are deep grievances on both sides, the answer, time and time again, has been war, not diplomacy.
So you can see, this is anything but a simple single-issue conflict, right? It's a completely tangled web of grievances. Sure, it's about land and borders, but it's also about refugees and who gets to go home. It's about security and occupation. And now it's about this massive ideological rivalry that's pulled in the entire region. Now, from Israel's point of view, these conflicts are framed as wars for survival. The narrative is that these are defensive actions necessary to protect the country from what it sees as existential threats from groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and of course, from a nuclear-armed Iran.
But there's another perspective, a very different one. Critics, and that includes many countries and international law experts, they argue that the sheer scale of Israelis' military actions has caused catastrophic harm to civilians. They say it's dangerously destabilizing the whole region and may even violate international law.
But if there's one thing that becomes crystal clear after looking at a century of this history, it's that the trauma isn't one-sided. Both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate, deeply felt historical grievances. And this pain has been passed down from one generation to the next, just fueling this cycle of conflict that feels, well, endless.
And all of this history leaves us with a huge, daunting question. It's a question that's going to define the future for everyone in the Middle East, not just Israelis and Palestinians. After more than 100 years of deeply rooted grievances and so much bloodshed, can diplomacy actually overcome war? Or is this just the new reality?